Hi, everyone. I'm Pierre Ferrari, President and CEO of Heifer International. And today I'm joined by Almaz Negash, who is the founder of the African Diaspora Network. And really looking forward to having a conversation with her. I was just asking her just before we started broadcasting if she could help us understand what does she mean by diaspora. So it's all yours.
Oh, thank you, Pierre. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be with you. So the African diaspora, for me, when we started the African Diaspora Network, it meant to say that the contemporary diaspora or the continental diaspora or the new diaspora. So these are those of us immigrated to the United States probably after the 1960s. And we came here either for political, to escape political prosecution, for education, or other means we come to and immigrated to the United States. So those are the, I will continue to use contemporary to just mean the new diaspora. And then, of course, I am very aware of how I got to be where I am, and that the historical African diaspora, they've been here for 400 years. They came here without their own choice, and they have really opened up the road, and they paved the way for me and others like myself, the immigrants, to be able to create a life and livelihoods for ourselves and our families. I'm also going to say, Pierre, that one thing people don't understand, maybe they do, but I think the way in which to understand the new immigrants, people like me, is we come here with no generational wealth. We have to work extremely hard to advance ourselves, to go to school, and I have to say, I'm very happy to say that we actually are, in terms of education, at the highest level, at par with other immigrants, in proportion that between Asians and Africans, we're very few immigrants, but we actually do very well in education and in advancing ourselves and getting good jobs and all that. We need this because when you don't have anything, all you have to do is just keep working hard and hard and hard. And I know this. I'm married to a husband who also happens to be Eritrean. So all we've done since we came and got married 26 years ago is really work very hard again to make a livelihood and living for our children. And that thing called the generational wealth that we didn't have, we had to reinvent and create that for ourselves. And so this is actually good. And that's what helps us to send remittances and do good things in the continent and the communities where we live. I hope that makes a bit of the distinction for you.
Yeah, no, that really clarifies it. I think, the immigrant story, whether it be from Africa or anywhere else, the idea that education is able to propel people, into a livelihood that's full of well-being and happiness and comfort and some stability is terrific. So, as you know, I've talked about it. I'm part of the African diaspora too. I was born in Africa and I immigrated here in the 70s. So, yeah, I'm really happy to be part of this conversation. So, you mentioned in your remarks there, your opening remarks, that remittances is part of the diaspora culture. And as you probably know this, but I don't know what the African remittance levels are, but globally, the World Bank has estimated remittances to be around $600 billion a year, which of course is much bigger than the overseas development aid, which is about $150 billion. And so let's talk about that. How, I've known these numbers for a while, and I've always thought to myself, how is this money used? Is it consumed? Is it invested? What's going on? And what could we do better or not better? So.
Yeah, and so remittances are just, as you said, it's global, and Africans are absolutely the most generous diasporans that I know. Whenever we are asked, we give. And in fact, there are so many of the diasporans, really a lot of their income goes back to support their community. So I think it's about, according to the World Bank, we are between 40 billion to 50 billion, but then who's counting? Because you've got different numbers. But the majority of the remittances goes to Nigeria, and it makes sense because Nigeria has 200 million people. And then you've got Egypt. Liberians are also the most generous. They give back a tremendous amount of their income back to Liberians, and I'm always in awe of the kind of support that they provide to their own community. But that goes all over the continent. I also know about the Eritreans and Ethiopians, Kenyans, and others that continue to give money. And I think remittances play a big role in Africa, not only just the family that receives, but also the countries. They benefit from it. It really is a mitigation thing for these countries, especially the small, poor countries that don't have much money. They can actually use this to leverage their economic activities. So if a country gets, I believe in, probably in late 1990s, Eritrea was getting up to $400 million per year from remittances. That's huge in terms of numbers. So what does it mean for the country? Well, you've got people with consumption power that they can go and consume, and that really helps the economy. And it's also a leveraging thing for other policy-related, economic policy-related for that country and others. And so I think remittances are 3 times more, as he said, than aid that Africa gets from aid. And I also believe, if I'm not wrong, I actually do believe also it's much larger than direct foreign investment. So I'm always asking this question. If it is that, then what would it look like to treat the diaspora as an investor? But we're not. African governments are losing that, and not all of them. Some of them have done a fantastic job, and I'll be happy to talk to you about that. They've created diaspora engagement officers within their country office so that they can engage them. It's actually really in some places, I believe in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana, diaspora issue and engagement is part of their government system. And that's a very good thing to do, because now they engage the diaspora not only just as people who give money willingly to their family and support the countries, actually as investors. And in my opinion, they should be looked as investors. So that way change the discussion from just remittance going to families, which we will talk, and I know this is a very important discussion, but also some part of that money can be invested in other things that is very important, not only to the families that we're sending it to, but the larger community as a whole.
Yeah. So I never heard of this diaspora engagement idea. This is a terrific idea. And I'm going to follow up with my team actually in Nigeria. We have a area VP there is in Lagos, so she can follow up on that. So is there? I mean, do you have some observations or some stories, or even stories about investing the remittances rather than consuming it? And I understand your point about consumption actually helps the economy, especially if what's consumed is locally produced, right? And one of the problems in Africa is Africa does not produce the food it eats. I think it produces something like 30% of the food and it imports the rest, which is a real shame. And we're working on improving that percentage dramatically. But so what kind of stories do you have about how that gets organized? Or is it just at a local, sort of individual household level, or is it at a different level?
So, it's remittance is very personal, huh? Individuals send because if you have a family in need, you know what their needs are, and you will continue to send that money to them. So this is really between the diaspora sending the remittance and the families in whichever country they are. The question that I'm always asking is, okay, that's a transactional thing between families. What about to think about an investment? Because one of the challenge right now is remittances are not scalable. Because if you're only sending it to your own family, it's pretty much going to that family. But what happened over the last 10 years, ADN has been, 10 years, we're going to come to our 10 years in August. And thank you. What I have noticed is that we are really doing the very best, and I'm very proud of the diasporans within the ADN network. What they are doing is they're getting out of that whole thing, remittances, and they are just using their innovative entrepreneurial spirit to go back to their home countries to invest. I can give you some examples of what that looks like. For example, I know some very wonderful friends of mine who were in the education sector in Silicon Valley. These are Ethiopians, and what they did was they put their resources together and started a private school, private university, private high school in Ethiopia. Similar thing in other parts of Africa, but I'm going to talk about Ethiopian diaspora because the connection is incredible. And also the number of diasporans from Ethiopia is pretty high in the United States. And so one of the very beautiful story about Ethiopians in the diaspora, in the medical sector, is that a lot of the medical doctors got together, put money, seed funding, to create or to develop one of the state-of-the-art hospital in Ethiopia. And that kind of cooperative system goes on and on by every country in Africa. Most of the countries in Africa, they have diasporas. You've got a Nigerian diaspora, very, very well-educated and well-meaning, and they do send as much, but they also invest in their own country, but also in other parts of Africa. You've got Ghanaians, the same thing. So the story goes back, between sending money to family and then the diaspora saying, no, I'm going to actually go back and use my knowledge, my expertise to contribute back to the continent. I know of an incredible, generous human being here also, a supporter of ADN, who put his money to really start a training program in Ethiopia and other parts of Africa. So you can see these things happening. And then on the agriculture side, you also see some Harvard educated going back to the continent saying, we're gonna start a coffee growing co-op. So this is happening, and it's happening as we speak, but it's also happening two reasons, I think. One is because of the care. We're very connected to the countries where we come from because we're the new diaspora. So we still have that sense of connectedness to the continent. The other thing is because they are very comfortable and confident to take the risk, because it's a risk when you start to get away from sending remittance to family, and now you're thinking about the greater good of the community in terms of investing. That's a different thing. And they're not saying, when am I going to get my money? Of course they should, and they do some, but I think most of them are really doing this for the long haul, and they are willing to sacrifice whatever that is to make sure that they advance their cause.
Going back to the country and applying your knowledge and experience is the ultimate remittance, isn't it?
It is the best one. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it really is. It is.
So linking to that, our largest operation overseas is in Africa. And I have talked about whether or not we should try and connect with the diaspora and see if we can convince some of the members to go back to Africa to work for Heifer, right? Because the talent in Africa is just beautiful. As we search for people that have the kind of expertise, we have no problem finding them. But at the same time, bring somebody who has understanding of the American system and the American way of thinking, which is sometimes a little toxic, but nonetheless, and to bring them back or offer them an opportunity to go back. You think that's possible? I'm talking about finance, technology, agribusiness, just business management, just straight up governance and managing.
Yeah. So Pierre, that's a very good idea. And I think this is really happening. In fact, I have to tell a story because that gives you a context of what you're talking about. About 3 years ago, I got an email from Shell Foundation. And that email said, do you know if there are Africans from the diaspora who would be interested to go back to the continent to do these things? And I'm looking at them and I'm like, send an email saying, was my own sense of saying, why don't you just train the people in Africa and leave the diaspora alone? But I think in retrospect, I know the reason for that is the sense of that, do we really need to look at the diaspora to go back to the continent? I think this is a very personal choice, and it's not an easy one. We both know. If you ask me today, do you want to go back to Eritrea? I'm going to say no. The reason is because I have 2 children and a husband and a family and a community that I belong to. How do you do that? How do you, uproot yourself and go back to where you come from? So I think it's a personal choice, but what I like to suggest for Heifer is work with us and identify these things, and I will mention them. So you've got this entire supply chain, the agro supply chain, from production to sales. There are so many areas in that the Africans from the diaspora can utilize their innovative and entrepreneurial spirit to it, that they can actually become partners. You do an amazing work, Heifer does, training grassroots and small farmers. That's very, very important, but because what you're doing is you're really looking at the families in these farms to make sure that they are sustained. It's not like a one-time gift. It's actually a sustainable way of figuring out how do you really have a livelihood for the long haul, rather than you wait for Almaz to send you money, and when she doesn't send money, that you have nothing to go for. And that's also the drawback of remittances, which we should talk about, because that's a very important one, especially during COVID. I think what we need to do is, even for Heifer or others, is how do you tap into the diaspora, and how do you build that relationship, build that engagement, and then have them either invest their money, their skill, or if they're willing and the offer is so good from Heifer, I will say, yeah, I'll go back and I'll work for Heifer, whichever country or community.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a permanent. It doesn't have to be a permanent assignment. There's 2 or 3 year assignments, and also, or even consulting work and everything else. Because there is, clearly, I think you're right. There's a preference to hire people who are local, but you can't always find talent in the country in which we operate, right? Or the level of talent that we're interested in. It's changing, it's growing, it's improving, but still there's some aspects to it. And I tell you, the thing that keeps me awake at night in terms of everything that we do is, and because we work at the grassroots level, as you know, sometimes we expect too much out of the farmers, for example. We expect them to run co-ops and manage co-ops, and they really don't have the ability to do that. And we train them, but it's not the same as having grown up in a system where there is management, there is, the whole culture of how to manage an operation. And that's where I was thinking that Diaspora could be really helpful. Ethiopia, Nigeria, come in and just as an assignment for 2 or 3 years, so that the people you work with in the community get trained along the way. I don't know.
I'm sure they will be interested.
Just an idea.
No, but it's a good idea. In fact, I think it's a wonderful idea that people need to know what that is. And then one of the good things we have with ADN is we have an online platform where we can communicate with with our network and send them specific things that is available. If there is a job opportunity, if there is a curated something that people need to know, we just like to verify. And once we know that's a verified thing, we kind of send it not through the newsletter, but directly to the people on the online platform, because they've signed up to be on the platform. So I'll be very happy to entertain that. And then why not? People have a choice. Yep.
Yeah, of course. That's the American way, right?
Yeah, why not? Give them a choice, and then see. But Pierre, can I just ask this? You mentioned the lack of training, and we both are from the continent. And one of the things that I think we might actually really, really need to do is keep partnering with entities and institutions, not only in the United States, but throughout the developed countries, to make sure that knowledge is staying in the continent, but training. And I'll give you an example, the same thing. We have a very good friend in the healthcare center doing a very good job in Kenya and in Rwanda, but the question always for them has been, okay, people keep talking about telemedicine, but Almaz, this is a person who said to me, the people that we are trying to work with in these places, they don't have the training, so we need training. So I think, Pierre, maybe if you could continue to speak about that training in wherever you are, I think that might be a good way to begin to tap into the African youth and start to train them.
Yeah. We have a large program in Uganda, Tanzania, around African youth. We were very sensitive and aware of the youth bulge that exists in Africa, and the problem that it's creating, because way too many. I mean, the unemployment rates are just staggering.
I agree.
But we're working on that, and we think the agribusiness, the agri side, is an opportunity not to what I call. I don't think the youth wants to go into the field with a hoe. They don't want to do that. Who does? But there are other opportunities in terms of agribusiness. You mentioned that there are some downsides to remittances. What is that?
So I think the remittances, so let's talk about COVID-19. I mean, you've seen the data that's coming out. And so even early on, as soon as COVID started, the World Bank and others start to really monitor remittances. And what they've noticed is that's actually going down by about 20%. Why is that? Because the very people who give remittances, send back remittances to the continent, most of them are frontline workers in the United States. Let's talk about the very people that have probably got sick or their jobs were cut. If you work in the hospitality industry and these companies and institutions are closed, what do you do? And so I think that is where I see an opportunity for governments. And I am happy to say that the African Union is now addressing this. In fact, I had a call with them yesterday. And one of the things that they're trying to do is really create a very well thought out strategic plan on how the diaspora and remittance can also be, some of their savings can be invested to do good in the continent. I mean, this is a new RFP they shared about in May, and I think they're going to come up with the winner. We'll see who that might be. But I think what I'm saying is they know the value that the diaspora contributes to the continent. My goodness, we do. But the question is, what do you do when a diaspora, and there's a wonderful study, Pierre, if I find it, I'll send it to you. I actually need to see this. I was in Ireland in 2018 to speak exactly about this, the role of Africans in the diaspora. And one person, we were from global diaspora. And so one of the person who spoke was from the Philippines. As you know, the Philippines are the most generous people. And Philippines is one of the largest exporter of human capital. I mean, really, literally all over the world. And what they've noticed, and they have a very good data to back this up. What they've noticed is when the person who was sending the remittances dies or something happened to that person, the entire family in the Philippines, whichever community they live in, their livelihood just goes down to zero, simply because they were dependent on that money. So I think what we need to think about is, how do you not be dependent on this? And I'm always advocating, it might not be to the liking of other people, but I advocate, can we find ways to turn these remittances into investment, even for the family? In your case, it would be to support my family in the villages of wherever they are in, if I choose to create a small hatchery or some kind of a small farming for them that they can sustain and have a livelihood for the long haul. Otherwise, if we're just making it transactional, I send you money and then you use that money for food for this month and clothing and all that, and you have only about, 5% left to save. It's not that easy. It's not going to be easy. And that's where my concern is. And right now, during COVID, I'm not sure when the remittance will go up, but right now, according to the World Bank, it went by about 20% is lower right now.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point. I must say, you've got my mind going now. You know, because we work with families, that's our work. We work with co-ops, but fundamentally, we work at what I call a disaggregated level, you know, with individual households. And I think we could offer that opportunity for the diasporans to support the work that we do in certain areas, is, you know, if they're interested, to actually support the training and the placement of animals, you know, the model that we follow, because that is an investment model, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're not giving them $1,000 to buy a cow. You're actually placing a cow with all the training and the feeding and the animal health, et cetera, et cetera. That's the investment, and that's really interesting. Yeah, I understand why you're worried about it. I think, and right now, of course, with the lack of income, which is what's happening, right? You know, COVID-related lack of economic activity. You've got this phenomenon. Wow, that's going to be very painful for a lot of people who have lost their income and lost the ability to help their families. You know.
Yeah, and that's a challenge, but it's also, I also think, Pierre, it's an opportunity. Like he said, Heifer can offer these opportunities that exist in terms of having the diaspora to invest. What are the opportunities? And I can tell you, there are many people in the housing industry, for example, you know, diasporans, we love to buy houses wherever we come from. It's like we are an ownership society. We just love to invest in houses. Was the same thing too, you know, if you're in villages, if we choose, if there is an opportunity to invest in a small farm holders, and they happen to be our family, or that's how we want to support them, I don't see any reason why that is not possible. You know how that system works, but I look forward to learning more and seeing ways that we can engage the diaspora intentionally and really deliberately, because we're all over the world, we are dispersed, and we are also, as I said, we come with no generational wealth, and we do the best we can to make a livelihood for us here and in the continent.
You reminded me of an episode. I was in Guatemala, and we were traveling way up in the mountains, and you know, and we were doing some work in coffee, and we came across this small village, but the village was pristine. The buildings were all, you know, brick, cement, and then all the roofs were tin roofs. You know, it looked really prosperous. And I said, "Wow, what are they doing here?" And my colleague said, "This village decided about 10 years ago to send all of its young men to the United States, all of them, as a group. And most of them got in, or at that time they could get in, and this is what's happened." Yeah.
Yeah, it's a challenge. So the same story, I went to Zacatecas, my favorite place in Mexico, for work many years ago. Yeah. And when I talked to I was wondering why there were too many young people and not as many older people. And they said, well, all of them are in the United States. And so if you look at in proportion, Zacatecas lives on remittances, and they are also the most generous people. Mexicans send a huge amount of money back to their country. But the problem is there is a social impact that it have into the communities. And so it's always, you win sometimes, and there is always the negative aspect of it. But I think in a way, the community thrive through the money they get, but at the same time, it is a very challenging thing for the social fabric of the family.
Yeah, it's quite a risky thing, but it's worth doing, obviously, because they're so poor. I tell you what, I think I'll follow up this conversation with another meeting that you and I can have about how to explore how we could arrange, you know, to support the diaspora in this idea that investment provides essentially long-term protection for the families they care for.
Exactly.
That's very much what we're doing, huh?
Yeah, no, that's very, very important.
Okay, good. Wow. Any last words that you would like to share with the team? Or we keep these short.
Yeah, no, they're very, very, this was really good. I'm going to say this, and I think this is very important, and it aligns with what you're saying. We, the diaspora, we care about the continent. Yeah. I would like to see the governments of Africa care about the diaspora, the well-being of the diaspora. The reason I say this is because if you happen to be a frontline worker, and then all your money, and a lot of them are extremely generous, and they keep sending it back to their families, what happens to them when they are here? Who makes, you know, who supports them in other ways? And there are ways to support. I also would like to encourage African governments to look, as I said at the beginning, to look at the diaspora as a partner, as an investment partner, not just as someone who they send money and you use it as you take it for granted. I don't think that should be it. I think if you look at the amount of money that comes from the diaspora to the continent, it is humbling. I am very amazed by the resilience of the Africans, and their generosity is beyond imagination. We are philanthropists and we invest, but at the same time, I think it would be great to see some real collaborative effort between the different countries where we come from and collectively with the African countries in many ways. I think it's very, it moves them to do this because it really benefits both.
Yeah, no, that's great. We'll continue this conversation because it's really of interest to me. I think it'll be benefit for Heifer and benefit for the diaspora, and of course, most importantly, for the poor and the population in Africa. Okay, Almaz, this
Especially
has
now.
been
Thank
great.
you.
I'm going to let you go, and I've just really enjoyed the conversation, and expect a follow up. Okay, good.
I will. Thank you, Pierre. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye bye.